Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. If you guys love diving deep into the fascinating world of Starship design and manufacturing and the philosophy behind these corporations, or you simply just want to add a publicly traded Starship manufacturer to your portfolio, then you've come to the right place. On this channel, so far, we've explored the biggest and smallest names in the Starship manufacturing industry, breaking down all these companies' individual strengths and weaknesses, along with the unique touches that set them apart from one another. But today, we're going to be spotlighting a starfighter manufacturer that holds a very special place in the industry. They've crafted some of the most legendary fighters ever, blending sleek aesthetics with unparalleled functionality. I'm talking about none other than Incom Corporation, the brilliant minds behind the T-65V XWing, the starfighter that won the Galactic Civil War. Now, Incom Corporation is quite a unique company. If you take a look at their wide range of products, there's a very clear design philosophy driven by a very focused and progressively minded company culture that has managed to keep Incom ahead of their competitors in all the most meaningful ways. Today we're going to take a look at how this humble corporation came out of nowhere and became one of the most inspirational and beloved Starship manufacturers in the Star Wars galaxy. Now, we've talked about a lot of larger and older legacy Starship manufacturers in our previous videos, like Porsche and Kessel Corporation, which has been building ships for thousands of years. So older companies face a very similar problem that, if you're a gamer, you face when you're at the end game of a game like SimCity or maybe Civilization. The original infrastructure, the departments that you build to design, manufacture, and market your products are eventually going to become antiquated. It's extremely hard to properly plan and structure your company to be operational, within 100 years, let alone thousands of years. And so a lot of these older companies have older mindsets, they use older manufacturing techniques, and they're just a lot more rigid in their culture and how they do things. Some of these more vertically integrated corporations that manufacture all of their own parts and components might even be held back by how their factories are set up. For instance, Senior Fleet Systems was heavily invested in the twin-ion engine, which was designed for the TIE Fighter line. It's truly an engineering marvel, and probably one of the best propulsion systems to ever come out of Senior Fleet Systems. But the problem is when you have a very well-designed platform, you tend to lean on it very heavily, and you probably don't focus on investing for alternatives, which can hurt you down the road. So let's say 20-30 years down the road, we find out that fuel thrusters, like the ones found on the T-65V, while less efficient, are far more powerful than the twin-ion engine setup. Senior Fleet Systems might continue to try to invest in a more antiquated technology like the twin-ion setup, and that's because they might not have enough resources or the internal political will to switch over to fuel thrusters. Remember, you'd have to design a new factory, hire new people, and more importantly, you have to hire old staff who might be very loyal to your company. And of course, if you do that, it's going to hurt morale. Such is the cruel reality of very competitive markets like the Starship manufacturing industry. So even though it's pretty hard for a small corporation to break into what is really just a highly competitive market with a lot of government corruption and favoritism, more focused and newer startups do have a slight advantage over more traditional companies when you have the introduction of new technology or just like a new political culture. Basically, the playing field is leveled out. Think about EV manufacturing. China was absolutely terrible back in the day at creating internal combustion engine cars. They basically copy a lot of designs as well, which wasn't great. And the truth was they were far too behind in their technology and developing the supply chains and infrastructure necessary to have some kind of homegrown car industry. They did have a few companies here and there, but nothing that really was successful enough for export. But with the beginning of the EV revolution, you saw hundreds of Chinese companies spring out of nowhere. These were startups that had to create their own new supply chains and technologies. Many would fail, but because of a huge domestic market and demand, and also very large government subsidies, the Chinese EV companies that survived were far better situated to make EV cars than traditional internal combustion engine manufacturers, who still have suppliers who make products you won't even find on an EV, like a combustion engine or a transmission. Traditional car manufacturers face a dilemma. Do you get rid of old departments that are no longer relevant or won't be relevant in 10 years? Do you get rid of old suppliers and fully invest in the future? Or do you split your resources between the old and the new? Either way, they're at a disadvantage because they don't have a clear focus on which direction they want to go. Companies like Volvo actually spun off their EV company Polestar so that it could focus solely on EV development with its own board and executive staff. I think that's probably the better way of doing this. I'm not even sure if EV adoption in its current form is a good idea, as inevitable as it might be. What this is really about is understanding how disruptive new technologies can be, how they can create openings for new startup companies to get in and gain market share. And so that's kind of what Incom Corporation did with the Starship manufacturing industry. They actually didn't start out doing Starships. They were, however, in the Starship manufacturing supply chain. They manufactured repulsor lifts. Repulsor lifts are an incredibly important anti-gravity technology that basically replaced the wheel in the Star Wars galaxy. Okay, like most wheels. And this is a device that can lift anything from Han Solo's frozen body to an entire city, like Cloud City on Bespin. This is actually one of Incom Corporation's greatest engineering projects, a true galactic wonder when you think about it, and quite an opportunistic project. You notice that Incom always seems to be in the right place at the right time until it's not. You see, city-sized repulsor lifts are extremely expensive to build, but they're also extremely expensive to fuel. But since Cloud City was the administrative colony for a huge Tabana gas mining operation, it actually had access to unlimited amounts of cheap fuel. That's kind of what made this entire project possible, and it was a great look for Incom's portfolio. Cloud City was built in 400 BBY during the High Republic era, and the galaxy at the time was completely demilitarized. So creating repulsor lifts was a far more lucrative business plan than creating starfighters at the time. But Incom, like a lot of corporations, started sensing the unrest in the following centuries, especially in the Outer Rim, and they understood that there would be a need for starfighters, especially for planetary defense forces. And so in 147 BBY, Incom Corporation teamed up with Subpro, a starship manufacturer based in the Inner Rim. They weren't as glamorous as a lot of the more core-based starship manufacturers, and a lot of their ships were seen as inferior, which is why most of their products were actually sold to the Outer Rim. But I would actually argue that Outer Rim customers are a bit more discerning when it comes to making a starship purchase. They're a lot more rational, I think, than core-world customers who are looking for flashy exteriors, interiors, very powerful engines, stuff like that. People in the Outer Rim generally have less credits to spend to begin with, and also they need a much more reliable product because of the complete lack of infrastructure out there. Like when your starship breaks down in the Outer Rim, you are in a lot of trouble. And because of that, these starships also need to be pretty simple to work on as well. So in this joint venture, Incom Corporation would learn a lot from Subpro's starship manufacturing experience, how to take a design and bring it all the way to a finished product and then market it and deliver it. And Incom Corporation would bring the majority of the capital investment for this joint venture. Together, the two companies would build the Z-95 Headhunter and also the Aggressive Reconnaissance 170 Starfighter, both superb starfighters in their own right. We've done a lot of in-depth videos talking about both of these platforms. We've, really done deep dives into the stats and specs and, like what they can do. In this video, we're going to talk more about the design philosophy and business strategy of rolling out these starfighters. The Z-95 was probably the most bare-bones starfighter ever created by Incom. It's very much a pre-Clone Wars era fighter, multi-purpose and targeted towards planetary defense forces, which usually couldn't field too many different platforms and too many units. And so these starfighters lacked the hyperdrive to save on costs. Most planetary defense forces only needed to stay in local regions anyway, but they did have shielding and a variety of different armaments, including blaster cannons, concussion missile launchers, and a very useful ion cannon for disabling ships. The Z-95 was very well received and performed extremely well in the Outer Rim. They were reliable and sturdy and economic all at the same time. They're basically the perfect tool for the job. As a platform, the Z-95 would remain very popular and in use all the way until the Rebel Alliance days. Now, one of the smart things that Incom did with its starfighters is, from an aesthetic point of view, they made them look like more beefed up versions of air speeders. And so you have the large wingspan, while pretty unnecessary in space. It provoked a sense of beauty and elegance. It reminded customers that yes, this thing can fly. And since, most of Incom's customers did come from the Outer Rim, and a lot of these guys grew up flying air speeders, I think that really, the design motifs on this resonates with a lot of people. It also doesn't hurt that unlike a TIE fighter, when an Incom product loses power, it at least has a chance to glide down safely to Earth. Vertical wings do not generate lift, guys. Now, Incom, as a repulsor lift company, also had a very successful line of speeders for quite some time. You had, for instance, the T-13 airspeeder and also the widely popular T-16 Skyhopper. At just 7,500 credits a T-16 was a relatively cheap vehicle that most colonists and farmers could afford. These were extremely light aircraft that had excellent performance. Many famous rebel fighters started out as bush pilots, flying the T-16 around. This includes Luke Skywalker. Now, Incom was kind of smart. They basically made sure that the controls of every one of their ships were pretty similar to one another. All the buttons were in the same places. So if you could fly one of their ships, like the T-16, you could also fly their more complicated platforms like the Z-95 or even the X-Wing and ARC-170. This is a really smart business choice, I think, from Incom. Basically, Incom is positioning themselves at very different parts of the market, and they're like, hey, your first speeder is going to be us, and your last starfighter is also most likely going to be a purchase to us. Come into our integrated system. And the T-13 and T-16 weren't the only speeders they made. They also had the T-24 and the more robust T-35, which was basically just one step away from an actual starfighter. So from a design standpoint, you have controls that are pretty, universal through all of the platforms. Sort of like how Apple or Nvidia created its own software and interface to force people to use their products. But Incom takes it a step further. They don't want you to just be comfortable with flying their platforms. They want you to love what they make.
That's one hell of a pilot! Woo-hoo!
Not just from an aesthetic point of view, but also from a function point of view. When the Clone Wars began, the Z-95 was already starting to show its age, and it was modified and upgraded for the Clone Army's needs, and it would compete with other interceptors like the much newer V-19 and the even newer V-Wing. Incom decided instead of focusing on what was a crowded market for short-range interceptors, they would focus on much more niche products like the Aggress Reconnaissance 170 starfighter. The Republic Navy's Venator-class Star Destroyers were assault carriers, and each one needed a wing of long-range patrol and scouting vessels that could also double as an attack craft. The ARC-170 fit those needs, but was basically the exact opposite of the bare-bones designs of the Z-95. This thing had 3 crew slots, a rear gunner turret, a 1.5 hyperdrive, along with a very unique and robust medium laser cannon setup. Very few starfighters of its size had lasers as potent. We did an entire video about how the ARC-170 was misused as a platform and was actually a really great starfighter, but ultimately misused by the Republic Navy at the Battle of Coruscant, which is what doomed the company from getting future contracts. I would argue that it's hard to foresee political events like the collapse of the Galactic Republic, which is why, as an investor, it's important to diversify your portfolio and not invest money that you can't afford to lose. Incom Corporation, despite being an excellent company, zeroed out. And sometimes that just happens, even if there's no warning signs that it will happen. I'll admit I'm not really an activist investor, but there are certain things from a moral position that I just won't invest in, like the death stick industry or large gaming corpos like Kanto Bytes. There are also companies that I do like ideologically, and I will, buy a few shares here and there just to show them some support. Because in the Star Wars galaxy, in the Republic, the greatest religion and belief system is the capital markets, and there are very few incentives for corpos to do the right thing. The structure of a corporation oftentimes is designed to alleviate individual responsibility from the actions one make on behalf of that corporation. And what Incom does during the rise of the Empire is both idiotic but also courageous and somewhat inspirational. Incom would be one of the many corporations targeted by the Empire's nationalization efforts, and most of Incom's core design and engineering team would defect to the rebellion. One of their greatest priorities was to bring their latest prototype, the T-65B X-Wing, to the rebellion directly. Although Saw Gerrera and his crazies did attack an Incom factory and looted a bunch of X-Wings for themselves. The 8 X-Wings they had would form a squadron known as the Cavern Angels. The X-Wing was basically the sum of all of Incom's previous designs and experiences, as perfectly balanced of a ship as humanly possible. It had the simple, streamlined design of the Headhunter, with almost 80% of the functionality and extra goodies you found on the ARC-170. It had grid maneuverability, durability, shields, along with a diverse and powerful armament, including proton torpedo launchers and 4 individual wingtip lasers. If the Rebellion needed just one ship to do everything, then this was it. This was an interceptor, an escort, superiority fighter, and even a decent assault bomber in a pinch. Remember, both Death Stars and a Starkiller base was taken out by an X-Wing. More importantly, the familiarity of Incom control surfaces made this fighter extremely accessible to the collection of moisture farmers and smugglers who were being trained to fly against the mighty Empire. A lot of these amateur pilots did have, experience on Incom's airspeeder line, and so that made it a lot easier for them to transition to these state-of-the-art starfighters. The X-Wing was extremely easy and intuitive to fly, and it was nowhere near as finicky as something like the A-Wing. The last ship that Incom Corporation built before it was nationalized was one of the largest, the UT-60D U-Wing. Like all later Incom crafts, it had those Fusel engines along with the variable geometry wings, and a very sleek presentation overall. This was a support/transport ship that was actually relatively nimble for its size. It was terrific for carrying special forces units on quick insertion extraction operations, although its carrying capacity was quite low for its class. The U-Wing also had fast enough cruising speed so that it wouldn't necessarily hold back its escort fighters, and it became quite popular amongst the rebellion. Bail Organa would actually accidentally organize the transfer of U-Wings into rebel hands, and they would be used by various factions of insurgents, including Saw Gerrera's partisans and also the larger factions like the Massassi group. There was also a civilian variant of the U-Wing known as the BT-45D. It had half the engines. Incom under Imperial rule struggled quite a lot to pump out, excellent designs, and I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that most of the team left. One of the products Incom Corporation made under Imperial rule was the short-range interceptor known as the I-7 HAL Runner. It was actually a pretty decent little ship. It had very accessible controls comparable to the rest of the Incom line, and it was actually faster than the T-65B X-Wing, and it had shields, which is a big upgrade from the TIE Fighter. It also had a pretty small profile, making it difficult to hit. However, its cannons were quite weak. When deployed, the Empire usually sent hordes of these fighters trying to overwhelm enemy ships with the sheer amount of blaster fire coming out of them. The HAL Runner, however, lacked heavy munitions. It only had 2 laser cannons, and, had Incom actually put some proper effort into upgrading this platform, I think it would have been a pretty decent ship. In the last year of the Galactic Civil War, right after the Battle of Endor, all of the defectors from Incom would come together and form a new corporation known as Incom Freitech. They started out by producing the T-65B X-Wing in a more standardized fashion, and quickly rolled out the T-70 as well, which is an improvement on the original X-Wing in almost every way. It was especially heavily armored and shielded, showing Incom's dedication for keeping its pilots and customers safe. There's also some minor changes. Instead of having to use a crane to top-load a droid into the astromech slot, the droids could now be loaded from below the X-Wing from a lift. Droids were also given an interface to more easily fly the ship from the astromech slot. And decades later, Admiral Akbar, before he was unceremoniously sucked into space, petitioned for an upgrade for the T-70 project, and that became the T-85 X-Wing. This variant was as fast as the original A-Wing and had extremely advanced sensor suite on board. For decades of pacifism and cuts to the military budget meant that the New Republic pilots behind the control sticks of a T-85 X-Wing lacked the skill to fully take advantage of these crafts. Some of the best pilots in the galaxy were probably Rebel Alliance veterans who were now fighting in the Resistance, and of course, they all preferred the T-70. We had one last fighter during the New Republic age that Incom designed, and it was this beauty, the Tri-Wing S-91X Pegasus Starfighter, which they made with help from the Porsche design team. We don't really get to see this Starfighter in action, but it definitely is a looker. Well, there you have it, guys. That is the very interesting story of Incom Corporation. As you see, it's not always about having the largest market share or having the largest backers. Sometimes if you think a little differently, you can create some truly unique products. Of course, at the same time, Incom ultimately was destroyed as a company. If you had invested in them, you would have zeroed out, which is never a good thing, and that just shows us how volatile the Starship manufacturing industry can be. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below. Remember, guys, I am not a trained or licensed fiduciary. I am simply a humble spice trader. I'll see you next time.